skills that you need to understand. Got it. Okay. Recording is in progress. So today's seminar is about essential skills for a board member orientation, the do's and don'ts of being on the board. With that said, let me just start off with a brief introduction about ourselves. My name is Ben Mirza. I've actually been practicing law for over 20 years. I've litigated board of directors related fiduciary duty related cases on both sides. I've been on the offensive and the defensive side, and it's a very intense war. It's usually invoked by a member of the organization that has money, and they got really upset about how the board was and how
okay, now I'm going to cut you off for 1 second. Albert, you have your hand up? You have a question?
No question.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. So it starts off with basically the board not treating the one individual all that nicely, and that person really gets pretty upset. And they're usually the people with the money, and they don't have any reservations in going to war over it because they believe in the cause of the organization. So that's been my experience. Ed, you want to talk a little bit about yours?
Oh yeah. So again, I'm Ed Meyer. I am of counsel to Mirza Health Law. I've been practicing healthcare law for over 30 years now. I'm actually licensed in California, so I handle federal law matters such as federal regulatory compliance matters and other healthcare law matters. You know, my background, like I said, 30 years. I was at Mednax for several years and also represented individual physicians as well as large physician groups and hospitals and health systems, including being the attorney for the board of directors of a major statewide physician group, and dealt with board approvals, board activities, and basically the board members meeting their obligations of board membership. And with that, let me introduce you to our associate, Komal Mirza.
Thank you for the introduction, Ed. Good evening, everybody. My name is Komal Mirza. I am an associate with Mirza Healthcare Law Partners, and my primary practice area focuses on employment law issues, non-compete agreements, as well as helping practitioners establish their businesses and get their private practices up and running. Today's particular presentation should be interesting for many of you, especially those who are either serving on a board or looking to serve on a board. We have a lot of interesting discussion in terms of what to look out for, what your duties are. And with that being said, I would like to remind everybody that today's presentation is being recorded. It is for informational purposes only. We will not be providing legal advice. And with that being said, let's pass it over to Ben and Evan.
All right, so just know we're not going to be talking about any products or services consumed or used by a patient. So I think that's kind of our disclosure. We don't have any self-interest per se in this as far as patients are concerned. So back in a few years ago, I read an economic study that was published by the American Economic Association, and it was a 2016 study, and there's the authors listed on there. And the interesting thing about the study is what I highlighted in red. And what that study basically talked about was for every single percentage point that a hospital is more successful in delivering their healthcare services as it related to in this case, it was actually a cardiac procedure. For every percentage point, patients were willing to travel almost 2 miles for that better outcome. And so when you look at that and you look at market share, you can actually pick up market share the more effective you are as an organization. And a part of being an effective organization is to have a board that's also effective at governing the organization. So with that said, I think I really want to focus in on why we're here today is to hopefully make you and the attendees and the boards that you're involved in just better performing boards overall. Today's discussion is roughly a 50-minute discussion. We're first going to talk about the overview of the board. Then we're going to go into healthcare compliance, led by Ed. Then we're going to talk about the business of medicine and the handoffs and the risks that take place. We're going to talk about medical laws, rules, and the corporate governance issues that will arise. And in the end, we're going to talk about medical ethics and potential lawsuits that can arise from this sort of stuff. And if you have any questions, ask them as we go through these slides. You can raise your hand or type it in, and we'll address the question right then and there. So overview, role, and function, right? So, boards come in, almost every entity has a board, okay? So either a formal board or an informal board. But the way it works is you'll actually look at the different types of organizations out there, and that organization, depending on its function, will determine the kinds of boards you actually set up. So like, for example, if you look at for-profit companies like Molina Health, Cano Health, Mednax, like where Ed worked, there you'll have generally shareholders, and shareholders are really interested in profit. So the boards serve at the discretion of really the shareholders, and they're serving for the benefit of the shareholders. When you have a not-for-profit, like for example, Kaiser Permanente, Ascension, Holy Cross, Baptist, these are all not-for-profit organizations. And so, they actually have a cause in mind as they're serving the community. And then you also have like quasi-governmental institutions like the Broward Health and the Memorial Health Systems and Jackson. These are all quasi-government institutions because ultimately they don't have any marching orders to actually create a profit. They are here to serve the community. In the event that they run a loss, the taxpayers back these quasi-governments to fund the shortfall of funding. And that's usually done through our property taxes. And then last but not least, there's also a governmental boards, which are there to serve the public good. So like, for example, boards at the Department of Health. There's many different boards at the Department of Health. I think if I recollect correctly, it was like 25 boards is what they have there. And each one serves a very different cause and very different issues. They're almost like, I guess you would think of them as little divisional boards within the Department of Health. And then some of these organizations that you come across will have a blend of these four types of characteristics. But these are the four ways to actually differentiate that. Most boards, they play a role in defining the company. So in defining the mission, the vision, and the values, right? So I think everybody's pretty familiar with that, what a mission and a vision and a value is. But Ed had a pretty interesting point. Ed, you want to go through like your revenue and expense scenario as to how that takes place?
Oh yeah. So it's important for a board to keep the company focused. So you think about it, the board itself is the company. The board members then delegate down to the CEO and to the operators, the day-to-day operation of the company. But the board itself is important to make sure the company retains its focus. So it's focus on revenues, it's focus on expenses. So for example, expenditures need on the budget should, keep that focus of mission, vision, and values of the company rather than going off on some tangent where they, you start going these expenditures going off and then reducing the, profitability or the, the net profit of the company. So that's just also really important to always remember that.
And also, actually, when it comes to not-for-profit, they always say that they have a double bottom line, not just a level of profitability, meaning you've got to be marginally profitable enough to survive, right? So as a not-for-profit, that's your revenues have to be just enough to cover the expenses, right? But the double bottom line is the community good that they bring to their patients,
Right.
their customers,
to meeting the mission of the nonprofit.
Meeting the mission, yeah.
Right.
So now the role of the board. Como, you want to touch on that, or?
Sure. So in terms of the role of the board, there's three primary fiduciary duties that come along with being a board member. It's care, loyalty, and obedience. The first one being, the most important being the duty of care. You want to make sure that you're adhering as a director to the reasonable, prudent, and ordinary person standard. So basically what that means is that if an ordinary or prudent person in that particular role would take the care to complete a certain task or request a referral when it comes to a particular task or a project that the board of directors is confronted with, then it is your responsibility to make sure to carry that, take on that responsibility and request a referral or to request a report and to really take on that task. One incident in which, I've come across this was one of the boards that I actually worked with in the past had a few different situations come up when in the process of restructuring the not-for-profit organization. And so the question really came down to, do they hire forensic accountants to understand exactly what needs to be overhauled and what needs to be taken care of, or do they carry on with their own accounting team? With a little bit of research, we figured out that a forensic accountant team would be the best way to go about it, because other board members for similar organizations would do the same. And we went ahead and did that. The same with, legal issues. If it's important for the board, for an ordinary board to hire a team of attorneys, then you want to make sure that you do hire a team of attorneys when looking at a lawsuit, for example. We had actually organized a golf tournament, and there was an issue that came about. We were confronted by a lawsuit. We did have in-house counsel, and the question was, do we go with in-house counsel that has litigation expertise, or do we hire outside counsel? Eventually, we did hire outside counsel because that was the better route to go for the organization. So that's really where you see the practice of the duty of care. There's also a duty of loyalty. Now, depending on the type of organization that you're looking at, if it's a for-profit organization, the duty of loyalty is to the shareholders, right? Because the organization serves the shareholders. In a not-for-profit organization, the duty of loyalty is to the actual cause or the mission or the beneficiaries of the not-for-profit organization. So you want to make sure that you are putting those particular groups of populations' interests ahead of your own. Your own interests should not be coming into play when serving on a board of directors. And finally, there's a duty of obedience. What that essentially means is that you're making sure to abide by not only the local, state, and federal regulations that your board may fall under or the organization may fall under, but also to make sure that you're adhering to the articles of incorporation and any other regulations or policies that the organization may have in place. Those are the primary duties that you do really need to pay attention to as a board of director.
And one thing I want to mention with you guys, great summary, Komal, is again, the duties, the fiduciary duties of the board member. If an individual board member fails, and these are individual to each of the board members serving on a board, if they fail, an individual board member fails a duty of care, a duty of loyalty, a duty of obedience, that is where the board member as an individual can become personally liable. So let's say a shareholder lawsuit against the board or individual board members could be done because a conflict of interest of a particular board member, which was not declared, and he used the board for personal gain, or duty of care. And as we're going to talk about the compliance in a few minutes, duty of obedience, the failure of a corporation board members to ensure or take actions to reduce the risk of violating the laws of a corporation by failure to have an operating corporate compliance program or something of that sort, can raise personal liabilities to the board members. So this is the area that if you're serving on a board, you want to be active, you want to be disclosing conflicts, and you want to be taking those actions that are inherent in these duties. And again, key to all of this is documenting that in your board minutes. In your board minutes that, you weighed these things, you looked at these things. So even if you're wrong, if you took your duty of care, you are providing yourself some protection, as long as it's there in the board minutes.
Yeah, that's a very good point,
one last thing that I'll touch on is, how we were just talking about contacting a consultant, like for example, an accountant or a lawyer or an actuary or whoever it happens to be. The duty will arise to the point of, if you don't have the knowledge to consult with one or whomever you need to, you have to actually just take the reasonably prudent measure to listen in. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to agree, but it's the weighing that has to take place in your mind. That would equal the duty of care. So you don't always have to arrive at the right answer. You just have to arrive at a reasonably decent answer.
Yeah. So when I've done like board minutes for corporations that were approving major transactions, it'll show, they met, they considered, they received reports of like key operators within the company. Let's say the chief financial officer reported and discussed with them this transaction. They looked, let's say, at a valuation that was done for the transaction, and they looked at these things, and they then weighed it back and forth, and then they either approved or disapproved. Now, I don't necessarily get into the detail of what they actually talked about, but the detail is, did they take prudent action? Did they weigh and look and consider? Did they look at the pros and cons, and then did they then act? And that's reflected in the board minutes. It's important to do that. Assuming they're doing that, they have to do that, by the way. You don't write anything in the board minutes, so really they didn't really do. So, yes.
So, okay, so now let's touch on a little bit of the types of boards that are out there. If you actually look at some of these organizations, the larger they are, the more types of boards they seem to have. A lot of organizations will have like a board of trustees, which is usually comprised of the founders. And if the founders have already passed away, it's going to be someone or somebody or the people that they appointed to be the board of trustees. And they're really the long-term players and for the organization, that they keep an oversight and make sure that it's operating and running the way its original founders intended. Another type is actually a board of directors, which the board of directors actually directs and controls the management of the organization. And then there's also the managing boards, and the managing boards are usually comprised of the inside or the working chiefs of the organization, like the CEO, the CFO, or the COO. And then there's also the advisory board. So a lot of times you'll hear like people getting appointed to like the advisory board. Well, those are usually people with like very specific knowledge that can inform and educate the organization. There's even fundraising boards that are people who actually help raise money for the organization. So you'll see like American Cancer Society, and then they may have a fundraising board that gets out there and just rings the phones and brings in the money. And then there's also, last but not least, the working boards. So, and the working boards are the ones that really belong to like the churches and the hobby clubs and things like that, right? So like you may have a car club or a church where the board itself works for the church, performing a certain function, but they serve as the board. So it's like a working board, right? I'm sure some of you guys have actually volunteered to be inside some really small organizations in the past where you were one of the key cogs in the wheel to help make that organization function. That's a working board. Anything else you guys have touched on there, Ed?
No, it's good. That's got it. No, nothing else on that.
The roles on the board, there's actually several roles on the board. One is usually the chairperson, who's mostly responsible for like running the meetings and being the executive in charge of what the organization does. Oftentimes that can be the president of the company. There's also a vice chair who supports the chair, and they also serve in the absence of the chair to like run meetings and so forth. Then there's a secretary who helps with corporate governance and transactions, like what Ed was talking about, making sure that your minutes are documented properly, make sure that your agreements are done properly. Well, that would fall under the hands of the secretary, meaning that they would be the ones to have oversight on the governance and transactions.
And to maintain the minute books and things like that, the formalities of the corporation.
And then there's also treasurers, right? So the treasurers are responsible for overseeing the financial reporting of the company. It doesn't mean that they necessarily keep the books themselves, but they have to oversee the financials of the company. And and they have to do that with an eye toward viability and stability of the organization. Then there's also board members at large, and those board members, they just help where help is needed. Keep in mind that oftentimes the larger organizations will ask whenever there is a board meeting that the CEO attend, the chief medical officer will attend, the general counsel, the chief compliance officer will attend, and even the chief internal auditor. Not necessarily at every meeting, but at a lot of meetings, any of those individuals can be called to come in and actually discuss matters or just be present.
So let me make a couple comments on this. So the board chair, that's a key role. But again, the chair runs the meeting. It does not tell everyone what to do, because keep in mind, every member of that board of directors has an individual fiduciary duty of loyalty, care, or obedience. So that chairperson needs to make sure that the meetings are run in a manner so that each of those members can continue to meet their fiduciary obligations. Similarly, that board chair, in doing that, may go, oh, we have an agenda, we're going to consider some particular matter. Do we have the chief medical officer, if that's a necessary person, at this board meeting? Do we have the general counsel or the compliance officer or the auditor, if those sorts of matters are being considered at the board meeting? So that's an important role of that, and also to make sure that there's a secretary taking the right minutes. If the secretary's not there, appointing someone else to take the minutes. So that's a key issue. And also the board chair is often the person, because we'll talk about this moment, you have regular meetings and special meetings. The board chair is a person who could possibly call a special meeting if something happens that he's alerted to, where the board needs to meet sooner than already scheduled, and in accordance with making the right notices to the board, making sure the right notice is given to the board members, so all of them are on notice with the right amount of time to attend the meeting. So the board chair is a key function, but I just want to make sure that just because someone's a board chair does not mean that they run the company. They run the meeting and make sure the board itself is operating appropriately.
The next thing that we wanted to touch on was that a lot of boards have committees. The larger the organization, the more committees they'll have. And these are just a handful of different types of committees, and you can almost make up a committee for just about anything. You can have a committee set up for investigations. In this example here, or this slide, there's usually like the executive committee, which is responsible for the urgent or emergency actions of the business. There's oftentimes a finance committee, which looks over finances and annual budgets, bankings, pension plans, making sure that there's sufficient funds in these accounts. There's even, like, for example, when I was at Broward Health, we used to have a building committee, and this was a committee that would take a look at new capital expenditures as it related to buildings, facilities, and land. Then one of the most important committees to have is the compliance committee, and Ed's going to touch on that in just a little bit later, so I won't go through it a whole lot here. Now, keep in mind what Ed had just mentioned was that there's 3 types of meetings that can take place. There's a regular meeting, so like, for example, there may be a regular monthly meeting or a regular quarterly meeting. Then the special meetings arise as something new comes up, and those may happen, like, let's say in the middle of the month, because something just came up, and they might schedule something 5 days out, 3 days out, or 10 days out to talk about something that just came up. And then there's also the executive meetings where the team goes into an executive session, and those are usually built around something that's very unique, doesn't involve everybody, and it could be about a strategy session, it could be about pending litigation, it could be about just about anything that they need to actually discuss in private.
Right.
So now our next section, we're going to talk about healthcare compliance, and Ed, that's all you.
Thank you. So, keep in mind that now we're talking about boards of directors for healthcare companies. So healthcare is a heavily regulated field, and it includes criminal penalties for noncompliance. So as we discussed, the directors have duties of care and obedience that include, engaging in the due diligence, promoting an organizational culture that encourages ethical conduct and commitment to compliance with law. Now, why did I say those words? I said those words because that is what's in the Department of Justice's federal sentencing guidelines. They're telling the prosecutors, did the directors, if they're prosecuting on a federal criminal matter, did the directors did they engage in due diligence? Did they engage in promoting organizational culture and encourage ethical conduct, commitment, or compliance? Or is the culture of the organization so rampantly, bad and violated of law that the board just sort of ignored that or allowed that to fester? And that's where board members themselves could be individually attached to a criminal conduct that might occur. So to avoid all this, to really reduce the risk, is that board members and the board needs to adopt and oversee a proper and formal compliance program that can reduce the risk of these criminal penalties. It's important to note that if you say, well, yeah, let's have what's a compliance program? Many of you do know what those are, but if you don't, those are formal compliance programs as outlined by the Department of Justice and the Office of Inspector General of how these are to be operated. And there's 7 elements. I've listed them all here. I don't need to go through each one of them, but each of these have to be entered. Each of these have to be incorporated into the formal compliance program. Because, by the way, I used to be a compliance officer of a hospital. So my job as a compliance officer was to report to the board and make sure that each of these elements of, say, doing periodic education of the laws, periodic audits of where compliance risks are, and then reporting those audits, those results and what we're doing to the board directly oftentimes in an executive session. So next slide, please. So under the federal sentencing guidelines, the governing body must be knowledgeable about the content and operation of the compliance and ethics program. So I've just given you that list of 7 elements. So make sure as a board member that each of those 7 elements are actually being conducted and operated. They must exercise oversight also with respect to implementing the effectiveness of the program. So they have to oversee to make sure that the program is actually doing what it's supposed to do. So for example, one of those things that were mentioned was is there a communication so that people can, within the organization, can report to the compliance officer? That's an appointed position. It's often executive, chief compliance officer. Are they getting, I'll say, hotline calls? So when those compliance officers are reporting to the board periodically, are you asking, did you get any calls? If they're never getting any calls, never hearing about anything, oh no, nothing to see here, you got to ask, something's a problem. But keeping in mind that the compliance program is the internal thing to protect the company. If the compliance program isn't really there to send the company to jail, it's to prevent the company from getting into problems. So a good operating compliance program is one where, because people make mistakes, people make errors, and you might have some bad actors, that's kind of ferreting that out and then reporting up to the board that's being done. So the board itself, to meet the members need to meet their responsibility, should have someone on the board should have some compliance expertise. And if there's not someone on the board with compliance expertise, then have someone advising the board when the board meets who has such expertise. And again, as I mentioned, have that compliance officer report to the board, and then the board is actually asking that compliance officer at each meeting about each of these 7 functions elements that are there, and seeing that they are all being operated correctly. Look at the reports that are coming in, and then proactively ask questions, not simply rubber stamping what the compliance officer is doing, but really put the compliance officer tough and probe. Is the program really working? And are they findings? What are the findings of the audits? How was the audit conducted? How was investigations done? And that they were actually being done. And again, bottom line is include in the board minutes this active participation by the board members in this compliance oversight. such as they had the report of the compliance officer. They went into executive session. After executive session, did they take action or did they direct further action in response by the compliance committee or by the CEO or by someone else in the company in response to findings of the compliance program? Again, to make sure, let's say there's more education because there's a lack of it in certain areas, or to reduce to reduce the risk of the company. And that's what, when a company gets in a problem with the federal government on a criminal matter, that's what they're going to be looking at, is whether or not the board itself was taking the right actions to reduce that risk. And if they were, then it goes down to, let's say, the person who may have engaged in the actual criminal conduct. And they're looking at what is the atmosphere that's created by the board of directors for compliance with the law. So thank you. That's the next.
And
Well,
Ed,
before
can
we
I ask
go
a
on-
question? Can I ask a
Sure,
question?
sure,
real quick?
sure.
In relating to this, obviously, we all know in South Florida, we are the kings of Medicare fraud. Okay.
From way back,
So-
from way back.
That's right. So
Yeah.
it's a nice badge to wear. So with that being said, if you're sitting on a board of an organization down here or anywhere, and you do have that problem, how does that affect the board of directors, or how, as a board of director, do you protect yourself?
But one, first, fundamentally asking and making sure, ensuring that there is a formal compliance program. If there's no compliance program in place, no compliance committee, none of these 7 elements that I've mentioned that I listed out in the previous slide, if those things aren't there, then you're not protecting yourself. If you're not proactively making sure you have a compliance program yourself to basically, conduct education to make sure people know what the laws are and are complying with the laws, to make sure that the company's auditing internally, that the compliance function is auditing where the risks are, to make sure there's not a let's say overpayment or overbilling. And again, if there is, bringing it forth, making a report as appropriate. Again, we're working with legal counsel to do those things, to make a report of any overpayment received, and just making sure that there's guidelines and protocols. But as being in an area where there is significant, oftentimes compliance risk, the board members should be actively ensuring that the company has set up a compliance program, and then not just having it set up, but then periodically, quarterly meetings, meeting with the compliance officer, and I would actually suggest, it's maybe controversial, but meeting the compliance officer separately from the CEO, and asking the compliance officer, are you comfortable with how this thing's operating? Are you getting it what you need? Are you, finding that your education is being embraced, et cetera, your disciplinary actions you recommend, are they being done? Being separately the CEO. Now, it's up to the compliance officer to talk separately with the CEO, and I used to do that when I was a compliance officer. After those executive session meetings, is meet with the CEO and said, hey, this is what they were focusing on, just to make sure the CEO was kept in the loop. But feel that there should be a direct line of communication with that appointed compliance officer. And if you don't have any of that in place, good luck to you.
Just as a side note, for me, this slide, page 14, is actually a deal maker or a deal breaker. If the organization doesn't have this program in place and they are not allowing you to investigate and ask tough questions and probe, that to me is actually a big red flag as to whether you should even be on the board, because now you're being stopped from doing what you are reasonably expected to be doing. And this being, and that being a, healthcare organization that's benefiting from typically Medicare dollars or CMS dollars, right? There's a whole lot of penalties loaded up on the back end of it. I just would not sit on a board if they did not have a robust compliance program. And this right here, if you have your cell phones out, you may want to take a snapshot of this and just carry it with you. Because if you're going to be on a board, you want to make sure that these things are going on. Here's page 14. I'm going to hold it there for 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds. And then I'm going to move it on to the next one. So take a picture of this as well, because these are really deal breakers for us. We would not serve on any boards if they were not compliant with this. They can do a lot of other things, but this is something you got to have.
Yeah.
And you know, Department of Justice. I think Ed is so right about pointing to the Department of Justice and what the Department of Justice requires, because they will actually haul people into jail over this sort of stuff if things are done and they're just letting things go.
Now you could have bad, executive or a bad operator down several layers down that's doing something criminal. Let's say that occurs. But if the board of directors has been taking its appropriate role and making sure the education, making sure this, doing all these things, that won't necessarily bleed up to the board as a problem. It could push all that down to the actual, who is the author of the criminal conduct.
Those are really important slides, and if you guys need a copy of it, just let us know and we'll get you guys this presentation. So now let's talk about the business of medicine and what it involves and the kinds of risks that means. So in the business of medicine, it's obviously about patient care, but when it comes to patient care, there are a bunch of tasks that are being done at the next level, which is like you're doing scanning, testing, reading lab scores, you're reading scans, and what that basically means is that each one is a point of truth or a point of test where you can actually go wrong with something, right? So a scan can be done improperly, a reading can be done improperly. So these are all handoffs. And as a board member, you've got to just keep this in the back of your mind. Even though you're not responsible for it, the organization itself, depending on the task that it's taking on, could increase or decrease its risk based on what functions it's serving. Some organizations even take on, like, for example, transportation, right? So some organizations will give transportation to its patients. When you do that, what have you done? You've actually put a patient inside a car or inside a van, and now you're hauling them, and then you're responsible for returning them. Can you do that appropriately and properly? And if you can't, then you got to think twice about it, because each business task that you take on, the risk has to be way below the reward, right? So meaning like the reward has to be much higher than the risk. Even if you look at information technology or the health records that are stored, there's a risk there. Whether you're talking about just a flat out crash of the server, or you are talking about ransomware, right? There is the billing issues and the financial disclosures that take place. In hospital settings, you even have things like food services and janitorial and laundry. Those all create another level of another layer of risk that let's say a doctor's office doesn't have, right? So like, for example, the janitorial, the laundry, the environmental services, if they just start to use the wrong sort of cleaning agents and the floor gets slippery, now you're talking about people slipping and falling, right? So these are all little things that are occurring, but each one has like a risk associated with it. So I just want you to be aware of that as you sit on the board.
Yeah, you mean like, materials, materials maintenance, those rules, make sure those are there. I mean, I dealt with years ago, I dealt with a janitorial issue at a hospital where I guess they got some of this phosphorus or whatever, cleaning fluid, and they ordered it, it arrived, and it was like, the things were problematic. So they returned it. They returned it not via ground, they returned it via air. Well, guess what? That thing leaked. And the FedEx people saw this leaky container, opened it up, and realized that this was this phosphoric acid container, which is also in soda pop, by the way. It has some phosphoric acid. You look at that. That leaks through aluminum. So that was a big federal problem. Again, because they didn't have in place a proper materials maintenance program. The board shouldn't have asked that question. Do you have that in place? Do you have those things in place? Again, those are risks. Yeah.
I mean, you might just even when it comes to trash pickup, right? The Sharps containers, those are a big deal. you got to have the right sharps containers at the right places, at the right position points, right? So those are important. So now typically these businesses will carry different types of insurances, right? So on this slide, there is one insurance that's also a deal breaker, as we were talking about earlier. If you're on the board, if the organization doesn't have a compliance program and it doesn't have directors and officers insurance, that's a deal breaker. That tells me I need to get off the board, because in the event that something goes wrong, nobody's covering my backside except me. And most boards, they don't pay a whole lot to be on them. Most don't pay anything, right? So D&O coverage is really, really important, and you want to make sure that that's in play. Obviously, there's also cyber insurance, and nowadays cyber insurance is playing a bigger and bigger role with all of these data leaks occurring. I think just a few weeks ago, I got a notice from actually Broward Health that Broward Health had a data leak, and I think they informed a lot of people over that. And what is it? Florida Blue was another one that had a data leak recently. So I mean, they're happening. You got to have cyber insurance.
Well, again, keep in mind, there's a great listing of insurance that Ben has put up. And again, what is your duty as a board member? You should be asking, periodically, maybe once a year or whatever, asking, do you have these insurances in place? Are these insurances, that's your duty of care to the company? Are you caring for that company? Are you making sure that the executives have put into place all these insurances?
And then keep in mind, there's also something called a fiduciary liability insurance, right? So those relate to like employee assets, especially like pension plans. So if you're in a company that's got pension plans, you want to make sure that insurance policy is also in place. When you do ask questions about those policies, you want to ask what's the time period they cover, the limits, and the deductibles that are involved, and who do they exactly cover, and what sort of activities or events are included in that insurance, or what types are excluded. Like, for example, if you have like a property damage insurance, you may have like a mold exclusion, right? So or if you have a professional liability insurance, you may have certain things that are excluded, like there may like for example, sexual misconduct may be excluded from a professional liability insurance policy. Next, let's talk about the medical laws, rules, and corporate governance, and how it happens, and the series of documents and things you have to follow. So here is the hierarchy of things. First and foremost, there's actually governmental statutes out there. At all times, you've got to make sure you're in compliance with those. The government also sets out not just statutes, but rules and policies that they want healthcare providers to follow. And if the government itself is not setting it, then there will be special pockets or bodies, regulating bodies that'll have it. So like, for example, CMS is obviously a part of the government, but like TJC is not a part of the government, right? So these regulating bodies put together their own set of standards that, the government has decided now everybody has to follow them. So make sure your things are in compliance with that. So this is almost like a hierarchy of things to follow, and you got to follow this if you're on the board. There's corporate articles of incorporation. There's company operating agreements. Sometimes they're called shareholder agreements. There is corporate bylaws and even medical staff bylaws. So like, for example, hospitals have medical staff bylaws, and you want to make sure that as a board member, your organization is following the medical staff bylaws. And internally, you got to make sure that the organization has its own set of policies, that the policies are being reviewed regularly and consistently by the actual people that are responsible for those policies. So like financial policies will have to be reviewed by the CFO or somebody who works for the CFO. If you have compliance policies, that'd be the compliance officer. They have to review those kinds of policies. So there's a whole hierarchy of governance in healthcare that you don't find as often in other industries. Now, this right here, the slide number 22, is the source of problems when it comes to lawsuits against board members. Okay, these are the perceived conflicts of interest, perceived or actual conflicts of interest, and it's when one board member appears to be getting something of value from the organization without disclosure, and has kind of swayed the organization to their own benefit. So when that happens, you know, you've got to really reconsider what's going on. You've got to make sure that the person is disclosing their relationship with that particular transaction or decision, and when it comes time for making a decision, that they abstain from voting. So, for example, if an organization decides that they want to sell off a piece of property, and when that property is sold off, let's say, you know, I have my niece go over on the other side and bid for the, you know, make an offer for the property without taking it to an open bid. That doesn't look right, right? So it's when you end up having an undue benefit from an asset of the organization that you end up acquiring, right? So, or somebody that you know ends up acquiring, and that's the best time to actually disclose and abstain from voting. Now, generally, as a rule of thumb, immediate family members, if one of your immediate family members is benefiting from a decision that the company is making, it's a conflict of interest. If your business partner is benefiting from something, that's also a conflict of interest. Now, it's a little dicey when it comes to the extended family. So, like, for example, I just used the example of my niece, right? So she's not an immediate family member, right? But she is an extended family member. So depending on the board, you know, would you disclose that or not? I would, only because I don't ever want anybody to add to ever second guess what I did or what anybody that's related to me ever did. Now, there's also what's called bond financing instruments. So there's actually bond financing documents. And in those documents, there are covenants and restrictions that affect board memberships. And you got to take a look at those if you do have bond financing arrangements.
Yeah, and again, I mentioned the Ben, that's often an area that's overlooked, especially, you know, by especially when you say smaller nonprofit organizations that might be financed through bond covenants, because these bond covenants will say such things as you cannot have, let's say, a company. It's let's say it's a hospital, and you have a nonprofit hospital, and they have a closed medical staff for, let's say, radiology. Well, the CEO of the hospital really, under these bond covenants, cannot be the physician in that radiology group, because they're looking, it's like inside benefiting. So it's really important, if you're if your company's financed through tax-exempt bonds, to make sure that the provisions of those bond covenants that dictate what you've agreed to in those covenants with regard to board membership are being complied with, and not just simply, you got the bond, okay, now you can spend the money and forget about what those covenants are.
Okay. So now let's talk a little bit about the Florida laws and the statutes that sit out there. I just want you to be peripherally aware of this, because if you're on a board, just know that Florida has very specific laws, and I think a lot of other states too, especially like states like California and New York. They have literally chapters on how certain things should be run. For example, there's a chapter in Florida, in Florida's legislation, that is about public health, about maternal and maternity and infants, about chronic disease, indoor air quality, children medical services, mental health, substance and abuse issues, right? So there's literally, like, if you look down here at the bottom of the slide, and then there's even statutes on like hospitals and so forth. When it comes to healthcare professions, there's individual chapters. For physicians, they not only have one chapter, but they actually have two chapters. One is for the MDs and one is for the DOs. So if you look at chapter 458 and 459, those are two different chapters, and each one regulates physicians differently. Slightly different, not hugely, but it's there. Now, in here, what I found interesting and almost kind of funny was there was actually a chapter, like chapter 467, on midwifery, right? So who would have thought that the legislature would have put together a statute on that? But they did. There's even things on like occupations such as speech, audiology, nursing homes, dietetics, respiratory radiology. That's a lot of nitty gritty stuff that the Florida legislature has got its hands in. And as being on the board, you need to just be aware that these sorts of statutes exist. They're out there. And when your organization operates, it's got to comply with these things. Not only does it have statutes, but there's also what's called the Florida Administrative Code, where they put together rules that regulate certain professions. So those are out there as well. They're called the FACs, the Florida Administrative Code. And if you ever have any issues with something, give me a buzz and I'll help you find the right rule for the area that you're working in. Now let's talk a little bit about medical ethics, and we are almost about to wrap this up. So medical ethics, right? So what are medical ethics? Medical ethics is about a physician-patient relationship, and that the physician or the organization itself will be altruistic. It will not put its own financial interest ahead of that of the patient. It will not fee split. It will not give undue gifts and kickbacks. Even in the sale of products, investments, and loans, it's going to take a look at itself and regulate itself with integrity and accountability, and not by way of trying to take advantage of the situation. Another thing to consider under medical ethics is undue influence and sexual activity involving a patient is a big no-no. Not only is it a big no-no, I mean, it goes on a different level of investigation and prosecution. If something like that happens within your organization, you really need to be wary of it. Call your attorney fast. Let's talk a little bit about medical malpractice lawsuits. And, organizations are often faced with like medical malpractice claims. And the way, your organization will know that there is a medical malpractice claim coming, and you can talk to your C-suite folks, and maybe they'll talk to the managers that are in the front lines. There's sometimes threats made by patients. There's lawyers that start to call physicians. There's medical records that are being requested by patients that you're just like going, why are they even asking for something like this? And then there's, complaints filed against the physician's licenses, and there's letters of intent to sue. Those are basically your 5 different things that you can be looking towards to see what's lurking out there. Make sure your C-suite is alert about these, make sure that they're asking questions downstream so that they're on top of it. And that'll also cue you into what kind of problems are within the organization, and you need to ferret out. Now, should something go awry, the typical types of claims that do come up against organizations, and again, this kind of relates back to the handoffs that we talked about earlier, is that there will be things like claims made for like failure to respond to an emergency call by a patient, right? The patient might even file things like failure to respond to a request, or misdiagnosing a patient, or delay in diagnosing a patient, and so forth. So there's a whole series of things that can happen, and those are the kinds of medical malpractice sort of claims that can come within the organization.
So again, again, I think you're a board member, you're asking, knowing that these are the risks that are out there, oftentimes very common lawsuits, you're asking, are there policies and procedures and education there to reduce these risks? You're asking the CEO, you're asking, the chief medical officer, you're asking the various operators, what have you done? How are you looking to see if any of this is happening to reduce this risk? So again, to meet your duty of care, your duty of obedience to ensure that applicable laws are being complied with by the company.
And Ed, for that education process, I think the HR department plays a pretty big role in there, right? Because they help guide as to what the employees are going to get educated in, and push the education and the dollars allocated towards education for that.
Mm-hmm.
So with that said, if you're on the board, just remember, majority of your board positions are going to be unpaid positions. There's very few positions that actually do compensate. So if you're not going to be paid, the only real compensation you have is a recognition and the appreciation you will get from the people you serve. And so be civil to one another, show respect and kindness, and be graceful.
Yeah, and the nice dinners, because I used to go to these small nonprofit hospital, and when they had the board meeting, they always made sure they served a nice dinner there. So that's
Yeah.
also something you could get too.
And you're right. And those dinners are really pretty special too, because when you go to those dinners, you actually feel like you're a part of a team and you came
Yeah.
together for a cause.
Yeah.
It's a really nice feeling. So
And the cafeteria staff who are preparing that, they're doing something very special for their work. That's a highlight. I think it's a highlight for them oftentimes that they are not just serving for the patient, they're also serving the board of directors. So, as a board member, thank them when they come in and provide that service, because that is, really something that they're doing that's really special. Thank you very much.
that's it. If you guys have any questions.
Remember, we're being recorded. You want to take the recording off for questions?
Yeah, I will. First, before we sign off, but don't nobody leave yet. I just want to thank everybody for showing up today. And our next one, you'll be getting an email. It'll come up on is it the 15th, Ben, of February, I believe it is?
Yeah, I believe it is. Yeah.
Yeah, 15th February. And again, thank you for coming in today. And we're just going to go off recording and then go for some questions. Thank you.